this be the smoking gun. It has long been suspected here in Ireland that an unholy alliance exists between various elements of leftism, including NGOs, Antifa, various socialist groups, the mainstream media, the police, and even perhaps the government. As any of you who have read history will no doubt know, whenever the left gains power, they do everything they possibly can to hold on to it. As the famous saying goes, you can vote your way into communism, but you have to shoot your way out of it. The suspicions of many, myself included, of the existence of this unofficial and secretive cabal, this unholy alliance, is often dismissed by the mainstream media as nothing more than fanciful conspiracy theory. But something happened last weekend that may have finally blown the lid off this axis of evil. A smoking gun, if you will. An incident occurred at one of the many protests going on around the country against the forced settlement of unvetted, mostly young male migrants into various communities. This one in Coolock, a working class suburb of Dublin, where the government, as usual, are seeking to install up to 500 men in an old disused paint factory, very much against the will of the people who live in that area. What seemed on the face of it to be just another loony, lefty, Antifa-style counter-protest turned into something far more interesting and with far wider possible consequences and implications. By now, ordinary Irish people are well aware of the mainstream media and leftist organisations' attempts to portray them and their protests as far-right, fascistic gatherings, a danger for democracy and society itself, and so are constantly alert and on the lookout for possible agitators and troublemakers who might seek to stir up or create disturbances or violence for their hungry baying mainstream media accomplices to capture on film and then put on the 6 o'clock news, so that normal people can be duly educated on how evil and dangerous these far-right protesters really are. By now, everybody knows the standard playbook and how this game is played. With all this in mind, the protesters in Coolock spotted a small group of men seeking to stir up mischief on Saturday. They were quickly and energetically ejected from the vicinity. Their attempt to cause mayhem seemingly foiled, but in the course of their hasty retreat, one of the men inadvertently dropped his phone, which happened to be unlocked. On examination by some of the protesters, it was quickly established that the phone belonged to well-known journalist and media personality Paul Connolly, a man with deep connections to the mainstream media, in particular News Talk 106 FM, one of Ireland's main national broadcasters. But that was only the beginning. On examination of the phone's contents, many other very interesting things began to come to light. There were videos of Paul and other people in a hotel room preparing flags and general paraphernalia for the day's events. There was a myriad of texts and communications between our mainstream media hero Paul and various far-left figures and Antifa types regarding protests and counter-protests and the coordination of all of the above. Even more intriguing was the revelation that some Muslim men from the UK were involved, along with Paul, in the attempted subversion of the Coolock protest. As details continued to spill forth from the mislaid phone, it became more and more apparent that some very murky things were afoot. By way of defence, it was first claimed that this wasn't Paul Connolly's phone at all, and that it was all a complete fabrication, a desperate attempt to discredit both him and the mainstream media. But this theory, alas, quickly fell apart. Various individuals whose messages could be seen on the phone were quick to confirm that they had in fact been in contact with Paul Connolly, and that these messages shown were in fact their messages. One of the more interesting cases in point being none other than our old friend and Muslim cleric Dr. Omar al-Qadri, a well-known hate crime expert you may remember from a previous video of mine. And no, I haven't forgotten about him. Stay tuned. He was quick to come out and confirm that he was one of the individuals who had been in contact and that the messages were his. And as I've said before on this channel, if you can't trust a Muslim cleric, who can you trust? And so, as this firestorm continued to rage, it seemed everyone was talking about it. Everyone except the mainstream media, of course. To the surprise of none of us here, I'm quite sure. But they couldn't dodge the hail of bullets forever. So eventually, News Talk did indeed come out with a statement in an attempt to rescue one of their own, saying, and I quote from the statement, "News Talk is currently working on a podcast series with Paul Connolly, which will look at the rise of right-leaning sentiment in Ireland. The purpose of the series is to gain an insight and understanding into the views and outlook of this growing cohort." So, in other words, he was working on behalf of News Talk undercover. This, on the face of it, even to the casual observer, seems quite odd. As in, if we are to believe this version of events, Paul Connolly was attempting to infiltrate and gain a better understanding of the reasoning and rationale of the so-called far right by deciding to embed himself without any form of disguise and using his real name with the far left, and embed himself so deeply that he managed to become a main protagonist in some of their counter-protestive schemes. How he expected this particular course of action to help him better understand the so-called far right is unclear. His method, if method it is, has far less in common with such luminaries as Sherlock Holmes, Hercule Poirot, even Inspector Morse, than it does with the incompetent, bumbling Inspector Clouseau of Pink Panther fame. But to give him his due, at least when Inspector Clouseau went undercover, he used a false name and sometimes even wore a wig. Details are continuing to emerge, and this story may have yet more twists and turns before it finally ends. More secret and sketchy collaborations between various elements of Irish society may as yet come to light. But what is clear, at least to me and quite possibly to you, is that groups and various people are actively trying to undermine genuine peaceful protests and the democratic will of ordinary Irish people. There is an agenda being pushed, and pushed hard. The people with their hands on the levers and buttons behind the scenes may well find themselves dragged, kicking and screaming, into the light of full public glare. Could one mislaid mobile phone be the catalyst that sparked the revolution?